Making compost is really very simple. It's just about recycling your garden waste and kitchen scraps by putting it in a heap, so organic material rotting down naturally. That's all there is to it. And there are ways of speeding the process up, and there are some basic do's and don'ts of what you put in and what you don't. But if you do make your own compost, you'll get a warm, cosy glow of knowing that you're enriching your soil to grow healthy plants, you're saving money, and you're doing your bit for the environment by supporting habitats that would otherwise get dug up to produce peat for us to go and buy from garden centres. So we're going to show you how we do it here at Nant y Bedd Garden. In this short video, we're showing you how to create a heap in one go. So I've been stockpiling ingredients. So this is early spring. So we've got lots of dried herbaceous material from clearing the herbaceous beds. We've also got a bit of material from the compost heap I've just emptied. So we're putting stuff that hasn't quite rotted down, we're putting a little bit of that back in. We've lined the bottom of this bed with permeable mulching material. That's not absolutely necessary. In fact, you might want the worms to come through into your heap. This is a slightly sloping site, so it's just easier to dig out the compost by doing that. So I'm adding a mix of, here you see daffodil, deadheadings and so on. And now I'm about to add the kitchen waste, so things like banana peels, apple cores, trimmings from the leeks and all that sort of thing go onto the heap. No cooked materials from the kitchen, no meat, no fish, but just vegetable waste really. And then carrying on in layers, roughly layers of green and brown as it's described. So again, more of the dried brown materials, the dried ferns and so on from cutting them down over the winter, and adding green stuff. So this time of the year we're starting to weed the garden, so there will be creeping buttercup. Yes, that can go in. The roots rot down if you get the heap hot enough, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. And this heap at the moment is quite dry. There's lots of dry materials going on, so I'll be looking about to find some green stuff to mix in with it. This is animal manure, so this is sheep droppings from our few sheep we keep in a field next to the garden. So adding some of that because it acts as an activator. And I'm watering the heap as I go. It's very important not to have the heap too dry. That's a mistake that quite a few people make when they're making their compost heaps. They say, well, it's just doing nothing. That's because it's too dry quite often. Conversely, it can be too wet, and then you get anaerobic action and it just becomes a smelly mess. Here I'm trimming a hedge, so all that can go in. Cabbage stalks are very tough, so the idea is you want stuff to break down quickly. So here you can put it through a shredder, but here I'm just smashing it up with a lump hammer and snipping it up with my trusty Jacoti shears to make it into smaller pieces. And by chopping it all up, you'll notice I'm cutting up a lot of the materials here. It breaks down quicker the smaller the pieces are. Obviously, you're not going to spend forever cutting it into minute pieces. But also when you're turning the heap, you'll see me turning the heap with a muck fork a bit later on. You can give yourself real back problems if you try to attack the heap when you've got great long strands of things that haven't broken down. So 2 reasons. Here I'm adding more bedding, animal bedding. So this is out of our sheep shed where the sheep have overwintered. So it's straw, so it's a mix of straw, which is very good, and the animal manure. So that again acts as a good activator. Grass clippings also are brilliant for getting the temperature of the heap up. You don't want to put too much on at once, and here I'm adding a layer of perhaps 3 or 4 inches, and then I'm adding other stuff. If you're short of green stuff, here I'm clipping the new growth of nettles. That's very good for your compost heap. So put your nettle tips in if you've got time to cut your nettles. Of course you can eat them as well, and we do that sometimes. I wouldn't recommend putting them in once they've gone to seed, because you don't want too many seeds going in there in case you don't get the heat up enough to kill the weed seeds. So adding again, as you can see, the greens mixed in with the browns. And more material here from the weeding of the vegetable beds. Again, this is a lot more. We have a lot of creeping buttercup here. What I don't add, we have ground elder, which is fine in some places, but I wouldn't add ground elder roots. And if you've got bindweed, don't put the roots of bindweed in. Here I'm making sure that the heap is staying moist enough by putting the sprinkler on it. If you're short of activating materials, you can buy in compost activators. This one is something called QR, which stands for quick release. Used to be available from Garden Organic, but no longer. But you can buy it online, and I've been using it for decades, and it's brilliant. You just mix it in with water, and there you go. So if you haven't got access to animal manures or anything like that to activate your compost heap, it's a good substitute. And I've also discovered over the years that we really need to be putting more woody materials onto our soils. So this is semi-rotted wood chip. We have a lot of wood, we create our own firewood, so we have a lot of wood chip very often from the brash. So that goes on too. So here I'm covering the heap. Very important to keep it covered so you can monitor the levels of moisture. And we use duvets made out of our own sheep's wool. So when you're getting the heat up in your heap, important to keep the heat in and covering it to keep the rain off and to keep the heat in. So it's quite simple. I'll carry on building this heap up, but you know, I can just let it sit there now. And then after a few weeks, this is what will have happened. Again, you know, we've covered it, we've got the duvets on, and then when we lift the duvet off, you'll see what it looks like. After just a few weeks, started to rot down. This is a compost thermometer, which is very useful to help you monitor your temperature of your compost heap. Available online again, only about £10. Ideally, the heap needs to be between 45 and 65 degrees for several weeks, and then it'll start cooling down and there'll be a second process. So I'm creating a hot heap here. You can just leave it as a cold heap. This heap, as you could see from the thermometer, is only about 40. So with my muck fork, I'm giving it a bit of a stir, and you can see the heat coming out here as I'm doing this, to let more air in. Very important to, if you want to create a hot heap and do it quickly, to make sure there's air getting in there. I'm not turning the whole heap, I'm just turning the top layer. That's usually enough to get the heap going again, and then I'll cover it and back up again. So what you get at the end, and this is almost there, it needs a bit more breaking down, but I have been using this to mulch veg beds and so on, perfectly good. A few bitty bits in there, and if you come across any larger lumps, you can always chuck that back in the next heap. So that you can use to mulch your veg beds. Here it is in amongst the peas and the flowers. This is a bed that's going to have brassicas in it. A bit later on, doesn't matter that it's quite coarse, that's absolutely fine. To find out more, buy the book Composting for Gardeners from Garden Organic, or come on one of our workshops.